Thank you. Thank you. Before we move to our next plenary on next generation philanthropy, it's my sincere pleasure to introduce Paul Brest. Paul is president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. The Hewlett Foundation's programs focus on many of the issues we're here to discuss, including global poverty, limiting the risks of climate change, improving education, and advancing the field of philanthropy. Today, in addition to commanding one of the largest philanthropies, Paul teaches at Stanford, and he writes a blog for the Huffington Post. If you want to find out more about his views on philanthropy, please be sure to check out his blog. He has also co-authored Money Well Spent, a strategic guide to smart philanthropy, which I think we'll hear some bits on this evening. One interesting note on Paul. Paul's a Harvard-trained lawyer, and as a young lawyer, he clerked for Supreme Court Justice John Harlan of the Warren Court. While a liberal by today's standards, Harlan earned the respect of colleagues of all political stripes by eschewing party ideology, keeping an open, independent mind, applying a rigorous method, and viewing each case on its own merits. I think as you listen to Paul this evening and as you read his work, I think you'll find evidence of these same virtues. So if you'll please join me in welcoming Paul Brest.
So Justice Harlan was from New York, and I have 15 minutes to tell you everything I know about strategic philanthropy, and I'm going to talk like a New Yorker in that speed. So you can think of strategic philanthropy as a journey designed to reach a destination, and I'm going to use the travel metaphor to its fullest and maybe even a little bit further. And I want to begin with the idea that strategic philanthropy, like travel, has nothing, it starts with your destination, and only then does strategy begin working. So, you know, your destination, you might want to go to Tanzania to work for the Peace Corps, or to Mount Everest to scale it, or to visit your Aunt Sally across town. Those are your goals, and every philanthropist, as the philanthropists in this room, have their own goals. It's once you have your goal that strategy kicks in. You want to get to your place in the most efficient way. Strategic philanthropy is not like the Cunard line slogan, getting there is half the fun. The hope is that getting there is going to be a lot of fun, but what really makes a difference is getting to your destination. And I'm going to use two examples. One is actually an early example of global philanthropy, and the other is domestic philanthropy, and I'm going to contrast them. And what I want to do is talk about what I think are the 5 main aspects of strategic philanthropy that you should understand, which is being clear about your goals, having a sound strategy that is based on a sound theory, getting feedback as you go along, and understanding the issue of risk. My guess is that most of you don't recognize these global philanthropists, but this is Ferdinand and Isabella. And they had a very particular goal, which was better trade routes to the East. You know, they were motivated, by the way, both by pure philanthropic interests. They wanted to do well for their countries. They wanted to spread Christianity along the route. But they were sort of early mission investors. They were also interested in their own fortune as well as fame. People's goals can change over time. My guess is most philanthropists in this room have different goals over different times. But at any given time, you need to know where you're going. No philanthropist is going to spend money on people sailing around the bay for fun, even though it may be a lot of fun for them. So philanthropy begins, no philanthropy takes place on a blank slate. There's always work that's come before. And for Ferdinand and Isabella, they needed to understand the field. And where did they go? They went to the Art and Science of 15th Century Navigation, published by the Hogwarts Press, you will see. And they read about ships and navigation and astronomy. They wanted to understand the field. They were grant makers, like many of us in this room. And what that meant is they needed to look for a great leader of a great institution. They did due diligence. Since I'm playing fast and loose with history, they were looking for Admiral Horatio Nelson and the British Navy for better or worse, they ended up with Columbus. All right, so you now have a goal, you have a grantee. You also need a strategy. And the strategy that they and Columbus worked out together was sail west. Up to that time, as you may know, the way to get to the Indies from Europe was either a treacherous eastern voyage or overland, which was even more treacherous. A strategy is only as good as the theory, the empirical theory underlying it. The basic theory underlying their strategy was that the Earth was round. By the late 15th century, most educated people thought that, although they were actually considerably wrong about just how large the Earth was. So we'll return to our global philanthropist in a minute, but I want to use an analog of domestic philanthropy. As I said at the beginning, your goals are a philanthropist's own choice. They precede strategy. And I've just put down a whole bunch of goals that actual philanthropists have had. And, preventing malaria in Africa is a good example. I'm going to use the example of improving educational outcomes for disadvantaged kids in Philadelphia. Obviously very, very domestic strategy. Just as Ferdinand and Isabella needed to look for a grantee, so do our philanthropists who are interested in improving educational outcomes in Philadelphia. In this case, they could have looked for a charter school leader. In this case, they found the person they wanted in the superintendent of schools in Philadelphia. That was the result of their due diligence. And at that point, just as Ferdinand and Isabella had to learn from the field, so do the funders and their grantees. And maybe later on we'll have a chance in the discussion, because maybe an issue that some of you want to raise, who should do the work in actually working out the strategy and the theory of change. But some combination of the funders and grantees have to learn from the field in the same way that Ferdinand and Isabella learned from the field. There are many, many different theories about how to improve educational outcomes for disadvantaged kids. I've just put a few up here, requiring school uniforms. TFA uses bright, committed new teachers. KIPP academies use long school days. The main point is that you have all these ideas of what you're going to do, what the grantee is going to do. You know what the outcome is, better educational outcomes. There is so much philanthropy which doesn't fill in the question mark about what is actually the theory that's going to move from that to the outcome. And if you don't know what's going to fill in that blank, it is unlikely that anything's going to happen. If you think that doing a complex equation needs to fill in the blank, social change is much, much harder than any equation that anybody can put on the board. So a really important tenet of strategic philanthropy is not just having a strategy, but knowing that the strategy can work. You can't rely on a miracle. I'm going to use, because it's sort of a nice metaphor for philanthropy, adaptive learning as a strategy for improving outcomes. And adaptive learning is a fairly simple idea once you think about it, which is the teachers give feedback to each individual student on how the student is doing. They get feedback on how the student is doing, and they adjust their lesson plans accordingly. And the theory is that if this works, it will lead to better educational outcome. So you now have a theory here. So I'm going to turn back for a moment to Columbus, because you have a goal, you have a strategy, the strategy is based on a theory, but you need an implementation plan. You need to actually make the strategy work. So for Columbus, in some sense, the basic strategy was how you chart a course from Europe to the Indies, but there was sort of the business plan part also. He had to buy ships and provision it and recruit a crew as well. So back to Philadelphia. What do you do to implement a strategy of adaptive learning? It's a step-by-step, sometimes in our bizarre jargon in philanthropy, it's called the logic model, but it's not a bad word, because it's a notion that you have to do A that logically leads to B and to C, and if you screw up the steps, you're not going to get there. So in Philadelphia, for adaptive learning, you train the teachers in assessment, the teachers specify achievement targets, they then translate those into feedback from the students, and as they get feedback on how the students are doing, they they modify the lesson plan. It's really useful when you're pursuing any kind of strategy to have targets. That is, the goal of improving educational outcomes for disadvantaged kids is pretty vague. There's no way of being clear about your goals to say, just what do we mean? In 2008, when this hypothetical philanthropic intervention happened, 60% of fifth graders were doing math at grade level, and the goal is 80% by 2012. Why not be ambitious? Why not 100%? Well, that would be great, but the targets ought to be realistic in terms of what can be achieved, and they think that that works as well. So, you can see I am talking at New York speed. A part of philanthropy that I think tends to be overlooked, although I think we're getting better at this as a field, is getting feedback. Right? Columbus had a compass. And if any of you have ever sailed or flown by dead reckoning, you know that it's not going to be very long out of the harbor that you're off course. And then, later on came the sextant, the ship's chronometer, which itself was the result of a very interesting philanthropic prize. And probably many of you drive at home, what you don't even need to, with a global positioning system. Columbus would have been very pleased to have that, I think. And similarly, in our example in Philadelphia, you need to see how you're pursuing your logic model, how you're going according to your plan. So if the first step is to train teachers in assessment, well, you need to make sure the teachers are there being trained. Maybe you'll do spot exams. If they have to specify achievement targets for each student, you ask them to report on what they're doing. Maybe you do spot checks on what they're doing, and so on and so forth. But especially in social change, which everybody in this room, whether you're a grantee or a grantor, is involved in, knowing how you're doing and then doing course corrections is absolutely critical. So Columbus's tracking was as good as it could be. The basic theory was right. But this is an example, and I'll say a word about this in a few moments, of failed philanthropy. Columbus and his crew may have been really pleased to end up in the Caribbean, but Ferdinand and Isabella were not. That is not where they wanted to end up. What happened in Philadelphia? Well, we actually don't know what happened in Philadelphia, but we do know from the result of many randomized controlled studies, something which is beginning to be funded more, even in development areas than it used to, that adaptive learning has significant effects in philanthropy. It can raise kids' scores, 7/10 of a grade, which is no small part. So I want to end by talking about risks. So for Columbus and his sailors, and of course his grantees, but his grantors, there was the danger that, all the dangers of navigation in the late 15th century, and the risk that the sailors would mutiny because they ran out of provisions or they were afraid of running off the face of the earth, and perhaps the possibility that they would actually fall off the face of the earth. Who knew back then for sure? For most of philanthropy, the big risk is that philanthropists put a lot of money into a venture, and of course the grantees put their sweat and time, and it just doesn't work. It's not that philanthropy can't do harm. Indeed, if you think about Columbus, the sailors brought smallpox and syphilis and other diseases to the New World. But for most of philanthropy, the danger is not harm. The danger is just not achieving what you expect to do. So I'm going to end with a thought about how do you think about risk? And what I want to suggest is, for most of philanthropy, we can't do equations. It's interesting to try to do calculations about cost and benefit. And some people in this room, including the Hewlett Foundation, have pushed this. You push it as far as it goes because then you don't know how far it goes and then you back up. But what I want to suggest is thinking about risk in terms of cost and benefit is very useful. Because sometimes it's worth taking huge risks, and all global philanthropy is taking huge risks, right? The likelihood of success in the ventures that are represented in this room are often not very great. But why think about risk? And why, for one thing, if you don't think about risk, you don't know how to mitigate them. Secondly, that there are risky ventures that are worth doing anyway. The Hewlett Foundation has made the single largest commitment in its history to work on climate change. the co-author of my book, Hal Harvey, is running a new foundation that we are one of the major funders of. The likelihood that everyone who is working on climate change is actually going to keep the temperature from rising more than 2 degrees over the next 10 or 20 years, which is our goal, is not very great. But the benefit, or to put it differently, the consequences if we don't do that make it well worthwhile taking the risk. Third, talking about risk. You think about your own lives have learned more from failure than from success. And finally, different philanthropists and different organizations have different tolerances for risk. So if you talk about failure and understand risks, you can then understand where your own risk tolerance is and just how much you're willing to do. So I think that comes close to the end. I think I've talked about the goals. It's almost the end. I'm unashamed to say a word about the book because the royalties for the book don't go to Hal and me personally, but to the Hewlett Foundation. And the bookseller who was out there before said, could she stay for dinner and sell books afterwards because that's when people are motivated to buy. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether you're motivated. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Perfect. Yes.
Oh, bright lights.
What's up?
It's the end of the day and it feels
Good evening.
Just twisted, says.
Good evening. In this rapid fire programming, we're up next. I'm Mark Kramer, and I'm a co-founder and managing director of FSG Social Impact Advisors, which is a nonprofit philanthropic strategy consulting firm. Also, we focus on measuring impact and evaluation as well as developing strategies. And we work with foundations and corporations and nonprofits and governments, pretty much all of the players involved in social impact. I'm really pleased to be here this evening and very honored to be up here with this panel. I really enjoy the GPF conference. I've been to several of them before, and I have to say that this is a group of people from whom I have learned a great deal. I've been involved over the last 10 years in consulting and researching and writing and publishing in philanthropy, and not a week goes by that I'm not inspired by some story I've come across from a philanthropist that I've gotten to know through the work. Some really unexpected and remarkable thing they've been able to accomplish. And all of that has contributed to my learning. And so many of the people in this room are the ones I've learned from, that it's really an honor to be here. The title of this session is Next Generation Philanthropy. And it was explained to me that this is not about younger people, but this is about version 2.0, or 3 or 4, or whatever version we're actually on. And in particular, how do we think about strategy and innovation given the difficult economic climate? And how do we use the circumstances that we're living through and that we're confronting today to find new ways to do our work and more effective ways to do our work? And I think it's essential that we do find new and effective ways, because as much as I've heard wonderful stories from philanthropists over the years, I haven't seen very many of the real problems in this country and this world change. And I think philanthropy needs to find new ways to work if it's going to be more effective. When I've talked with the most effective philanthropists I meet, I find that they don't talk about giving away money. They talk about solving a problem. And that brings a very different lens to their work. Because when you begin to think of a problem, you begin to think of its many different dimensions. It's not just about the nonprofit sector. It's not just about money. It's about the role of government. It's about the role of media. It's about the role of advocacy and public will. It's about investment and business opportunities. It's about shaping public opinion. There's so many tools in the toolbox. And increasingly, I see funders moving from being individual, isolated funders who write checks to organizations to taking a new approach as being really problem solvers who are helping to lead change with a much more diverse toolbox. And I think that the panel tonight is a great representation of that diverse toolbox and can talk about it from their personal experience. I want to throw out 4 quick themes, and these will come as a surprise to the panelists because we haven't had a chance beforehand, but I know they're up for it. As I think about this shift, I really see, first, this idea of cross-sector collaboration, of approaching problems through multiple dimensions. Second, an emphasis on systems thinking rather than a linear, shall we say, strategy from point A to point B across an ocean, for example. Third, that it really leads to a different view of evaluation and measuring impact that is not about what did my grant accomplish, but is about how do we as a field learn to be more effective each day and each week in our work. And lastly, that leadership is so much more important today. Our nonprofit sector is so fragmented, both on the grantee side and on the funder side. And we're not really able to get to a critical mass unless they're individuals who can stand up and really create coalitions around their personal leadership to confront and make progress on an issue. And those, I think, are the opportunities, none of which require money. Those are the opportunities that we are in a position today to see even more clearly and to exercise more strongly. So you've heard enough from me. I'm going to introduce the panelists. The one other piece of instruction I have to give you is on your table, there are question cards. And at any point, when you feel moved to ask a question, write it down, hold it up, and someone from GPF will come around and collect it. And then I'll be able to go through the questions efficiently and get answers. So I want to introduce our panelists. Paul, you know, but sitting next to Paul is Sandy Herz, who is the Senior Advancement Officer in the Film and Media Unit at the Skoll Foundation. In that capacity, she manages their relationship with PBS, with NPR, and with the Sundance Film Festival. It's a great position to have. And prior to that, Sandy was the Vice President for Marketing and Communications at the Foundation, and before that was the Executive Director of the Software Development Forum, a membership organization of 2,000 members among software development companies. Next to Sandy is Akwasi Aidoo, who is the Executive Director of TrustAfrica, which is a foundation that aims to secure the conditions for democracy and equitable development in Africa. He has a long list of his career before that. I won't go through all of it, except to say that he was a program officer for health and development in West and Central Africa with IDRC. Before that, he ran the Ford Foundation offices in Senegal and Nigeria, and he has taught at universities in Ghana, in Tanzania, as well as the United States. And to my immediate right is Sonal Shah, who is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation in the White House. The objective of the office is to catalyze action by citizens, by nonprofits, foundations, and the private sector to create a social innovation fund that promotes partnerships between federal agencies and private actors. Prior to just recently taking this position, Sonal was the head of global development efforts at Google.org. Before that, she was a vice president at Goldman Sachs, leading their environmental strategy. And she as well has a long list of other credentials going back to time in the Treasury and National Security Council that I won't go into detail. But with that introduction, it's a wonderful panel. And let me ask Sandy to begin, and I guess specifically to think about the multiple dimensions to problems we confront today and how media and communications plays into that.
So, as all of you are aware, the Skoll Foundation's focus is on investing in connecting and celebrating social entrepreneurs in order to advance systemic change. And when we talk about systemic change, we're talking about addressing large-scale problems, which often require not just the work of the social entrepreneurs that we're doing, but really a broad engagement across a global population in order to really create the level of change that we're talking about. And Jeff Skoll has believed for a long time that it's the growing gap between the haves and have-nots that are driving these really big issues. And in order to do that, we have to close that gap. And social entrepreneurs are our best way to do that. So when we invest, connect, and celebrate, we really see those as kind of an integrated approach to our philanthropy. It's the three legs of the stool, if you will. And the celebrate piece of that is about using film and broadcast and media, social media as well, to really create a broader awareness that there is a global movement of people with big solutions to the problems facing our future, and to engage people in addressing those solutions, both by supporting the social entrepreneurs that are out there with them, but also by realizing that there are, in fact, big positive, there are solutions, and there is a hope out there, and that isn't just about the problems, because there's a tendency in media to talk about how bad the problems are and not to talk about the solutions. So specifically, in terms of what we do in film and broadcast, we work with the Lehrer NewsHour, we work with the Sundance Institute and their documentary program, we work with Frontline World, we're now working with the BBC at a global level, with the commercial arm of BBC, that's the BBC World News, to get the stories of social entrepreneurs out there and to engage people so that the resources can come in, whether it's talent or money or policy or research that will create that conducive environment that will get us to that closing of the gap and the change that we're looking for.
Great, thank you. Akwasi, I've tried to talk about partnership a little bit, and one of the challenges as we sit here in America or in the North trying to think about how to help in Africa is how do we really build partnership with indigenous organizations, with people on the ground in Africa who really know what's going on? What are the opportunities?
Right. First of all, let me say that I'm sorry my voice is almost gone. I just arrived, and it's been a long trip. So you excuse me if you don't hear what I'm saying very clearly. But I wasn't going to miss this meeting for anything because it's my first meeting. And if there's one takeaway point I've got sitting here the whole day listening, it's really the idea that values matter a lot, especially in situations of crisis. And the value that's placed on cooperation and partnership and working together, really resonates very powerfully. In Ghana, I'm an Ashanti, and we have a long proverb, that says, when the going gets really tough, the only thing you have going for you are your values. So they better be very strong and enduring. And if there's one place where the question of partnerships and collaboration is so crucial, I think it's in Africa. Because Africa has been literally the playground, and I don't mean this in any bad way, but it's been the playground of external donors and funders, each one coming in and doing their own thing, and it doesn't add up, it doesn't aggregate. And if you take any country, I was in Liberia very recently, where TrustAfrica has a partnership with Humanity United. And it's a plethora of donor agencies working in Liberia, each one doing the same thing, sometimes very close to each other. So it's a very important point. Now, the good news is that there are some really big and far-reaching changes happening in Africa that provide opportunities that we haven't seen for a long time, the recession notwithstanding. The first is that there's been a phenomenal growth of African foundations. I mean, African philanthropic institutions. As I speak to you, there's a new foundation being established in Nigeria by Danjuma. Danjuma used to be the defense minister for many years in Nigeria. He's putting together this foundation with hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, this is happening today in a recession. In South Africa, there are lots of foundations like the Shanduga Foundation, the Tokyo Kiswahili Foundation. We have the African Women's Development Fund, which is in Accra, Ghana. We've got TrustAfrica, the Foundation for Civil Society in Tanzania. There's an exponential growth, really, of foundations in Africa. And the interesting thing about these foundations in Africa is that, I mean, normally, you know, foundations will either do policy-related work or they provide services. You know, they focus on health and education and other services. The foundations in Africa are doing both, but in addition, they're putting a lot of emphasis on organizational development and capacity strengthening, capacity building. And that's key. That's key because what we've had in Africa is been what I've said in other forums, the syndrome of projectitis. You know, it's almost like a disease where, you know, the donors come in, they have a project, it's for 2 or 3 years, and with, you know, benchmarks and so on, and it's wrapped up, there's a report written, and you move on. And not much is left behind in terms of the vehicles that are required to keep things going. And so these African foundations doing service provision and policy-related work, as well as paying attention to the vehicles for delivering these things in a sustainable way, I think is a very, very important development. And I would say that all of you, I mean, those who are interested or are already working in Africa, should be talking to these African foundations. But they could be very vital intermediaries, even for re-granting purposes, definitely for peer learning. They are closer to the ground, they are based there. We're based in Senegal, we work in about 30 African countries. Over the last 1 year, I've been to about 25 of them. You know, and we've got all of them, the Africa Women's Development Fund, all these foundations are spread out and have presence around the continent. And I think they are a major source of knowledge, information, and my plea is that these are, you know, institutions that you really need to figure out a way to partner with.
Wonderful, thank you. Sonal, I really have a couple questions for you, but the first one, which I think everyone would love to know, is what will the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation actually do? And when will it start doing it?
Well, I hope soon. Otherwise, I'll be out of a job soon. You know, the Office of Social Innovation came about largely during transition as we were thinking about how to give civil society and foundations and others a voice into government, because government generally is seen as imparting information and not taking in information. So how do we create an office that was also about taking in information and learning from the field what was already happening, which is a large reason why we created it. And the president recognizes that government alone can't solve any problems or solve all the problems. It's got to be in partnership with many other organizations, and there's a lot of bottom-up innovations taking place. So how do we give that a voice within government? So in that process, we created the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. So the first goal, obviously, is using technology, new media, but also traditional methods of outreach to go out and hear the voices and hear about what's going on in the field, giving a place for someone to come to have a conversation about what's happening. What are the innovations that are taking place? How are people solving problems? What types of problems are they solving? And where are they? Second, to develop interesting partnerships, using the federal government sometimes as the bully pulpit, sometimes as the convener, sometimes it's just getting out of the way, and other times putting money on the table. But how do we develop partnerships with federal, local governments, as well as with foundations, individuals, nonprofits, and try to solve some problems together? So how can we help? So things to think about there are, what can we do in math and science education? This is something that's very important to the president. What can we do in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana as we think about changing to a new economy? And how can we come together to solve some of those problems together? And these are some of the things that we're currently looking at and trying to figure out what to do. The last is really, and you know, partnerships matter a lot to us. It's not just that the government does and everybody else follows, but it really is about where can we learn and what can we do differently. And what we hope to prove here is that the government is looking to do business differently. And we are looking at finding ways to create partnerships. We're going to have to change some laws. We're going to have to figure out how to make some of that happen, because there are legal barriers in many different places. But we're going to have to figure that out as we go along. But as we find it, we're going to go do them, and then we're going to try to figure out how to solve the other problems that come along the way. But more importantly, philanthropy has a flexibility that the government sometimes doesn't. So what we can bring to the table is maybe some money, or what we can bring to the table is a convening power, but not necessarily the flexibility of philanthropy to move money around faster or to try things a little bit more differently. We also work with Congress, so we've got to work through all of those mechanisms. So how can we create a partnership that allows us to bring what we bring to the table the best, and others to bring to the table what they bring best? Which obviously raises the big question of metrics, which is what you raised, and how do you measure results? What are the results you want to measure? What are primary results, secondary results? How do we think through those without penalizing the ability to learn and change along the way? And then the last bit is national service. It's not just about money that comes to the table. What can we do with our time and what we can do on our own? And we passed the national service legislation a few weeks ago. The President signed it yesterday, really giving people an opportunity to work with government, raising the AmeriCorps growth from 75,000 to 250,000. Again, government alone can't solve the problems. People need to participate. How do we allow and work with people to find problems in their communities, help them solve their own problems, but be a partner in the process and not just a bystander in the process? And that's something that's very important. So in the process, we're working across agencies, health, education, energy, especially along the priorities the President has aligned, and really thinking about how to incorporate national service into all of it. So that's our broad mandate of the office, and the legislation was our first piece of action that got done, and then we'll be moving on the partnerships going forward.
Wonderful, wonderful. And let me ask you just, yeah, absolutely. Good luck getting out of it after the talk, right? I think, let me ask you also just to step back, and given your experience at Google and at Goldman Sachs and in the nonprofit sector, what do you see as the changes happening in philanthropy, as the next generation, as the opportunities to think differently coming out of the crisis we've been in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that we're trying to do, and I'll put this in the context of kind of where we're starting, and then put a bit of a idea or some thoughts forward, which are kind of just general thoughts. But one, we're creating a social innovation fund within the Corporation of National Service. The idea there is to say, how do we invest in ideas or new ideas? Maybe old ideas, it might be new ideas, but how do we invest in them, and how do we grow them? And growth doesn't always have to be numbers scale, but it can be replication. It can be taking lessons learned and helping others use the same opportunities in other ways, but really thinking about growth of the nonprofit sector. And I think a little bit of what you said in the early comments of how can we combine our efforts together to have greater impact. And that's what we hope to do with this fund. And it's a small amount of money, it's $50 million, it's not huge, but it's a place to start for us to prove results and to show that we're thinking about it a little bit differently, and use that to replicate with other agencies. So we can go to education, we can go to healthcare, we can go to energy, we can go to labor. There's lots of agencies with different pots of money, and what we'd like to do is show how we can do things differently there and do that. I think, it's interesting, having worked on the corporate side, also on the foundation side, but being in the government, is there are strengths that each bring to the table. Corporations think about problems a little bit differently. They've thought about solving problems a little bit differently. I'll give you the simplest example that comes to mind is just job sites. Monster.com or all of the various sites that exist out there. People have figured out how to aggregate those pieces and find them. So the government doesn't need to create that. But how can we leverage or work with that, or somebody thinking through that more effectively than ourselves? But what we can bring to the table is a lot of eyeballs or an attention to that, to the idea of, if you're looking for a job, if you're trying to find a job, where might you go, or how might you go, or how can we partner with different groups that do that, because we're not going to create those things the best. Engineers do a really good job. We're not a group. I'm certainly not an engineer, but there are others that look at that more effectively and think about it better. And then what foundations, again, bring is the concept, and I think Paul laid it out in his talk, is what problem are we trying to solve, and how can they play a role in that process of it? And so there's an ability to think in all of those ways together, because the government has so many different missions it's trying to meet, because we've got the economic crisis, we've got healthcare reform, we've got energy. It's a policy that we can bring to the table, but there's practicality that partners bring to the table. So how can we work together in addressing some of those? And it's a challenge. I'm not going to argue that it's going to be easy, but at the same time, for anyone who's trying to get the stimulus dollars, well, no, but I can say that I think what we can do is try a different approach to it. And I think what you have in the White House is a willing partner to try that.
And just knowing that there are funders here who have both international as well as domestic interests, is your mandate just domestic, or is it international as well?
I'm based in the Domestic Policy Council, so it is somewhat domestic, but we are working with our colleagues in the National Security Council to also do the international.
Great, thank you. Paul, let me come to you and ask you to respond. I think we've had a wonderful dialogue over many years, some of which has been about theories of change and strategies. What I'm hearing up here is a very multifaceted approach. There's not a single ship and captain, to stick with the metaphor, but there are many players. And sometimes, I think when I was a child, they came out with a toy which I guess was not successful because I don't see it anymore, but it was sort of three-dimensional checkers, and there were 3 layers and you played on all 3 at the same time. I wasn't very good at it, but it seems to me that you get to sort of that kind of complexity rather quickly when you think about addressing social problems with philanthropy, rather than the more straightforward checkers game.
So, I mean, the examples I used were sort of strategic philanthropy 101, because I think you need to begin with the concepts. But I think what I've heard from everybody here, and Mark has made the point, that a lot of the work we're doing involves system change. And system change is harder than getting from Portugal to India, and harder even than well, reforming Philadelphia schools actually is an example of system change that's hard. And I want to tie this back to both the issue of metrics and then the issue of capacity building. Because the example that I didn't have time for is another possibility for Ferdinand and Isabella, which is rather than supporting the voyage, they might have supported some institutions working to deepen knowledge of navigation and the whole set of issues that would make voyage possible. And some philanthropists think that when you provide capacity building support, when you provide general support to organizations, that you no longer have goals and no longer have metrics. And I think that's absolutely wrong. I think it's harder in some ways, right? It's easier to know whether you've gotten to the Indies or to the Caribbean than it is to know whether you have built institutions in Africa, India, or the US. But in the end, it's indigenous institutions that will carry this out. And if one works hard enough, the metrics are there also. So I think of some of the work, the Hewlett Foundation has done work both to deal with immediate and urgent problems like climate change, but we also have made investments in research institutions and think tanks in developing countries, in working on transparency and accountability, which is also really building capacity. And in the end, if you only do projects which are easier to measure and forego the system building, which is an institution building, then philanthropy is going to miss what maybe some of its greatest opportunities are.
Terrific, thank you. I'm getting questions. Please send more, but I have plenty as well, so don't worry. Sandy, we've talked a little bit about how Jeff Skoll really has a sort of portfolio perspective on achieving social change. The foundation is one tool, but there are other tools as well. Could you talk a little bit about the portfolio?
Absolutely. I think, when I think about next generation philanthropy and where the work of the Skoll Foundation and Jeff Skoll's work more broadly is going, the exciting aspect of it is the whole armada, to extend the boat metaphor, that he's bringing to bear. So it isn't just the Skoll Foundation, but it's also Capricorn, which is his family office and principled investing and accepting outside clients and bringing that piece to bear. It's also participant media, which is putting out feature films and documentaries and television shows and developing a web platform for social change. And it's the new Urgent Threat Fund that was announced this week that will be led by Larry Brilliant, that will address the 5 most critical, immediate, and urgent threats to the future of humanity, and will be intended specifically to address those. So if you look at how those can play in an integrated and multi-pronged way, you look at something like climate change, and you have an inconvenient truth coming out of participant, creating broader awareness. You have Capricorn making investments in solar cars and solar panels and green technology. You have the foundation investing in social entrepreneurs like Mindy Luber at Ceres, and the work that she's doing with her investor circle that has, I believe, $7 trillion under management, and is working with the business power players on Wall Street, the pension funds and the endowments that have that long-term perspective and really care about what happens, and building out from there to create policy change. And together, these can all work in concert to actually move the needle and move things forward. And so I think all of us, in whatever way that we live in the world, don't just bring our philanthropy to the table, but we bring our whole set of tools, and we should think in an integrated and broad way about that.
Thank you. Akwasi, I have a question from the audience. What do you think of the book Dead Aid, which is, as you may know, a relatively recent book out that is a scathing indictment of the failure, and I'm actually reading from the question from the audience, scathing indictment, but I've read it and I know it's true, of the failure of international aid in Africa?
I'm a bit conflicted about it because I know the author. I think it's, if the purpose of it, Dambisa, if her purpose was to stimulate or catalyze debate and discussion around issues of aid effectiveness in Africa, then I think she's done a wonderful job of it. It's analytically a very impressive book, but it's conceptually very weak. She talks of democracy in a way that is not conceptually very clear. Aid is talked about in very generic, overgeneralized manner. A lot of the data that she has in the book have to do with bilateral aid. Then you move on to the next page, and it's all types of aid, including private foundations and bilaterals and multilaterals, and so aid is talked about in a very general sense and condemned. So I think it succeeds in drawing attention to a very important issue, which is aid effectiveness in Africa, and how the vehicles and strategies for aid could become improved. I mean, could become better than they are now. The other thing about the book, I think everyone should read it. I wouldn't necessarily advise that you go out and buy it. But if you can get it in a library, and I hope I don't get sued for saying that, but it's, she blames aid for everything. She blames aid for everything. She says HIV/AIDS and conflicts in Africa are all blamable on aid. Botswana is one of the most successful economies in Africa, but it's also a country completely devastated by AIDS, HIV/AIDS. And, it's not corrupt as some other countries are. So, the evidence, the data she has is simply not supported, or rather the analysis is not supported by the evidence on the ground. She says something in the book, and I must say it struck me. It just leapt out at me. And I can even tell you the page. It's on page 42. Because it's so reckless. It's so difficult to take. And she says, I'm not quoting her, but she says, in an ideal world, what countries are the lowest rungs of poverty in Africa? We know most of the countries, the lower 10, 20 are in Africa, or amongst them are the majority in Africa. She says, in an ideal world, what you need is a benevolent dictator who would come in and just get the work done. And then democracy will come later on. And then she goes back in history to show, this has been the pattern. So it's a tough one. It's a tough one, but I think there is a general issue about aid. There are three issues. One is that, again, I'll go back to a saying we have among my people in Ghana, which is that the best way to help anybody or any community is usually to figure out how you connect with what they do to help themselves when they are in need. In other words, you can't go in and bypass philanthropic traditions that already are in a community. And so external aid, which has often been parachuted in without any regard for, how people help themselves or how they struggle to help themselves, I think is an issue. The second is corruption, and just poorly designed. And I think Paul's point about you start with a goal and then you figure out the strategy. Often you think the strategy is ahead of the goal, or there's some hidden agenda that's not very clear. So there's a lot of mismanagement of aid. And then I think the third point that she could have picked on is the fact that the conditionalities of aid, in the 1960s, aid was largely shaped by the Cold War through the 70s. And then you had the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s in many parts of Africa and the conditionalities. And then later on, democracy became a conditionality and so on. And that's a huge issue. It's a huge issue that has had a very counterproductive backlash. Because across the continent in Africa today, you hear lots of people, irrespective of their political leanings, who would say, well, the Chinese in Africa are great, right? China is the big elephant in the room in Africa. And what they're doing, of course, is simply get the resources and then provide aid. And ultimately, that's a very dangerous path. And it plays into this book, which talks about, first get the rules, built, and then you worry about elections and freedom of expression and human rights and all these other things to do with democracy. So I don't know if I answer your question. It's a book worth reading. It's published, so it's out there. But it's a very troubling book in many ways. And the thing is, and I know I'm talking too much, but the thing is, it's going to be an influential book.
Oh, absolutely.
The cover, Kofi Annan, and I had a talk, I had a conversation with Kofi Annan, and I said, are you sure that you wanted this out? Because he says, this is one of the, Kofi Annan is there, I don't know who else, but it's being acclaimed as one of the path-breaking books to come out on Africa.
And right or wrong, surely the record of aid has not been wonderful.
Well, yeah, but there are good examples of,
sure.
Foundations, especially where they focus on issues of social justice and institution strengthening. And you can look at the history of aid in a more rigorous way, and there are good examples of, their best practices.
So one alternative, and let me ask the panel, to thinking about international aid and government aid is really more business development, more investment in local enterprises, whether it's above the level of microfinance to think about small business enterprises. One of the questions from the audience is how much willingness is there to think about using philanthropic funding as a catalyst for commercial investment, or using philanthropic dollars to really create profit-seeking businesses which can grow and expand and generate a lot of positive benefits, but somehow seems to step outside the traditional nonprofit and philanthropic sector. And maybe, Sonal, let me start with you.
I'm not sure I would speak on philanthropic aid from this hat, from my White House hat, but I think when I was at Google, in fact, it was one of the things that we were looking at is growing small and medium-sized enterprises in emerging markets, and how do we think about that? And it was no small debate, to be fair. Internally, the debate was over, well, shouldn't they be able to get commercial capital anyway because they're a company? And who's willing to take on that risk of putting in the money? And you know, it's interesting because when you listen to Alan Patricof talk about this, he would say the venture capital industry in the United States would not have started if it wasn't for philanthropy. That it was philanthropy that actually started to fund.
Apparently there's disagreement.
It was venture capital that started to fund commercial ideas. But I think to some extent it's a bit of the question that Paul asked in the point he made at the very end, which is like, what's the risk we're willing to take? And in business, the risk is, you know, it might fail. And are we willing to take a little bit of that business risk of it failing in order for private sector to grow? And I think that's the question that's the one that gets debated all the time.
Sure. Others, Paul?
I mean, philanthropy compared to business has such very meager resources that in the end, I think it needs to be agile and leverage all the resources it can, business and government. I mean, I think some of the experiments done by Google, by Omidyar, which are breaking out of which find the constraints of 501c3 too great, and are terrific experiments. We have to see where they go. But I mean, in the end, I think if philanthropy thinks only of itself in a container, it is not going to be very effective. I think some of the most interesting work being done in philanthropy is trying to take some of the risks and create some of the infrastructure that will allow business in. So a number of foundations are working on trade corridors in Africa. Well, they're not working on it because they think the ultimate way to benefit rural farmers is philanthropy. They think they're going to be helping pave the way for business. Ferdinand and Isabella mixed philanthropy and business, as I said.
Perfect. Sandy, I know the Skoll Foundation is very active in investment and social investment, mission investing.
I think that when I think of philanthropy, it doesn't have to be a grant. Philanthropy is about the love of humanity and the future of humanity. And so what technical form it takes, whether it's a for-profit investment, an investment in a company where you can have equity as a result of that, or whether it's in the form of a grant, or whether it's in the form of a loan guarantee or a PRI or what, that's what fits the opportunity the best. And so I think you start with where you're trying to get to, and where's the highest leverage, where are the most urgent threats, where is the greatest opportunity strategically, and then you figure out what vehicle you bring to bear to make that happen. And if it is technically for profit, that's fine, because the reality is we live in a world economy that's based on markets. And very often that is the most effective way to make things happen, is to kind of fit into that market system in a way where others can follow along. So to me, it's almost a false question.
And Akwasi?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically there are examples. The most recent perhaps is the Grameen Bank, which started off with some support I learned from the Ford Foundation initially. And so there's a lot more happening even today of philanthropic resources being used to help develop micro enterprises or things like that. I think one area that requires or could do with some philanthropic engagement is the investment climate and business environment. In Africa, there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of research and advocacy, and governments aren't going to be doing it. The advocacy organizations are not necessarily going to be doing it. They throw stones at governments when things go wrong. And so there's a need, I think, for some resources that will help to make the marketplace of policy, investment policy, more efficient by bringing researchers and advocates and policymakers together. But it's very clear that countries in Africa that have received that kind of investment have done much better in terms of trade and investment. So the policy angle, I think, is one area. There's a lot of, we don't have as many think tanks as you have here in the US, but some of that same approach, I think will be very useful, definitely in Africa.
And I'll just step out of my role as moderator a second, but add that I do believe this is very, very powerful, that when we started FSG, Michael Porter, my co-founder from Harvard Business School, and I were very much focused on foundations. And then we were approached by some corporations to help them think about their social issues. And we very quickly realized that major corporations have much more impact on social issues in the world today than foundations. And they have such an array of tools they can bring to bear. And market forces can be so powerful. One of my favorite examples is a company called Waste Concern that was started by 2 engineers in Bangladesh. And they noted that in the slums, the government was not collecting garbage. And they hired some of the unemployed people in the slums to collect garbage. They separated out recyclables. They composted the rest and made organic fertilizer, which they could sell. Didn't quite cover the cost, but then they found they could sell carbon credits, because when the garbage had rotted in the streets, it released greenhouse gases. So they were able to create a model where it cost them $30 to collect a ton of garbage, and they generated $60 of revenue. And they've been able to grow this in just a few years to serve 3.5 million people, and to begin franchising this in Vietnam and Sri Lanka and other countries around the world. And it's not something that a nonprofit, in my experience, could have grown or scaled up that quickly. And so, you're employing unemployed people, you're reducing carbon emissions, you're creating organic fertilizer. It's just a wonderful combination and sustainable. Let me go back to the questions that I was hired to ask. Sonal, one question refers to the convening power that you mentioned, and says, when can we actually do this? When will there be a White House conference on philanthropy, and will there be events in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and other cities as well?
Well, we've already started the convening power, to be fair. We work very closely with our Office of Public Engagement, and they've actually been bringing in a lot of groups. We've mostly started so far on the Recovery Act, and bringing in groups to talk about how they might participate in the Recovery Act. And last week, we brought in, I think it was 4 days of groups coming in to have those conversations. And I think as we move forward and as we think about working with education and health, and the healthcare group and the energy group, we're going to be bringing each of those groups in to come have a conversation with us about what might we do together, and what are the opportunities in green jobs, what are the opportunities in turning to a more green economy, where are the opportunities on preventive health care. But those are the conversations we're moving into next. The largest one, I think, will be for us on, in the next probably week or so, is on service. President would like to do a call on service. He did it yesterday a little bit, but how do we get people engaged in a more sustained way as opposed to episodic volunteering? How do people give time on a regular basis to solve real problems? So those multiple conversations are taking place. Conference on philanthropy is a great idea, and it's something that in my openness hat will say absolutely, and we will work on that. And I think as we kind of pull our ideas together, it's a great opportunity to do that.
Let me follow up with one other question, which is to say, what are the expected benefits of a shared and collaborative partnership between government and private resources. When you compare it to the historical benefits of competition, of parallel and sometimes conflicting, purely private-driven innovation. In other words, are there costs that offset the benefits of this kind of partnership?
That's a fair question, and I think I don't think we see ourselves as competing with competition, and I don't think we definitely do not see ourselves as the only player in the game. I think the aim of this is to show that partnerships can lead to outcomes. It's not to say we're going to do this in every part of the country. We may test it in 4 markets and hope that the market then takes over. But I don't think we're in this to show that only the government can solve problems or can get things done. But I think what we hope to do is to show that government can be an effective partner in the process. It doesn't always have to be seen as government as a bad partner, or neither does it have to be seen as a government as an ineffective partner. I think what we'd like to do, and I think I said this earlier, is in some cases the best thing we can do is make it easier for things to happen, and our role may be just to move out of the way. Our role may not necessarily be in that, but it's to assess that process and figure out what our role is and figure out what's the best way of doing that. In some cases, it might just be convening power. We can bring a lot of people together to the table. We might be able to bring state and local governments in a way that others might not be able to. So I don't think we see ourselves as the only player in the game. I think what we're trying to do is figure out how we can be an adaptive and a better, a more resourceful player.
Wonderful. We're going to switch gears as I follow the cards. And Akwasi, you said the goal of China in Africa is to get the resources and give aid and then go. But aren't jobs being created, and isn't this of value to Africa? And the real question they're asking is, why is China being judged differently than the former colonizers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think China is being judged differently at all. I think, you know, yeah, some jobs are being created, but also there are, just to counter that point, in the copper belt of Zambia, for example, you know, and this has become the trend in Senegal, where I live. This is also come up, where the Chinese will start off a project with local labor, and then, you know, they'll bring Chinese to take over, with all kinds of rumors about why, and all kinds of stories about how actually some of the Chinese who are brought prisoners, people who've been incarcerated in China. And so, I mean, there are a lot of human rights issues, labor law issues, labor rights issues involved. There have been some demonstrations, public demonstrations against China in Zambia, in Gabon, in several other countries around this issue. So it's not all that glorious that, you know, they're building roads and bridges and friendship bridges and stadiums and creating, you know, jobs. I think the evidence is very, very complicated. But I think the bigger picture really is that China has leverage with many of the countries in Africa, governments, I should say, that are very undemocratic. Mm-hmm. You know, Zimbabwe, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but soon after the elections last year in Zimbabwe, when all the trouble started and so on, there was a Chinese ship that was docking in Cape Town, in South Africa, full of arms, weapons. And the word got out, and the dock workers immediately mobilized and pushed back. They prevented the ship from offloading. And the ship then went on to Angola. The same thing happened. It went to Mozambique. It kept going around. And then, you know, no one really knows finally how it ended. But China's role in Zimbabwe, China's role in Darfur, in Sudan, in Equatorial Guinea, and so on, in Guinea-Conakry, where there was a recent coup. So it's a problem for African pro-democracy human rights organizations. And that's what I hear wherever I go, right? There's a bit of competition also between Chinese enterprises and SMEs in Africa, African small and medium-sized enterprises. If you go to Dakar, where I live, there's a whole boulevard now. It's a Chinatown, and it's left, right, and center small Chinese shops. And the Senegalese traders are beginning to complain. So it's a very complicated thing. And I don't think they are being judged differently. I think it's happening at a time when the agenda in Africa is democratic development, development that benefits everyone. And the role of China runs counter to that, potentially at least, and in many places in reality.
Thank you. There's a question for Sandy, but I actually want to broaden it to include Paul as well. The question for Sandy was, you talked about closing the gap between the have and the have-nots, and when the global population is growing by over 75 million per year, all of whom are have-nots, how do you really do that? And the broader question I want to bring to Paul is, as you think about setting goals in philanthropy, what are the sort of advantages and disadvantages of being truly ambitious? And I guess climate change might be one example, but let me ask Sandy first to respond.
It's a great question and a very tough question. I think the sort of highest order answer is that if you can give people who are living in poverty tools to help them get out of poverty and access to education, history has shown that they have fewer children and the population growth will come down. So we believe that by providing these kinds of systemic solutions and transformative solutions, that over time that will address these big issues. But I think population growth is still a tremendous problem, and we already have, we're living in a way that the planet can't sustain. And so are we going to be able to address that fast enough is a really good question, and one that I hope everybody in this room can help us to figure out.
And to start with the specifics, I mean, the Hewlett Foundation is one of a handful of foundations that has been concerned with family planning and reproductive health from the very beginning of its existence. And I think the links between that and poverty have become clearer and clearer as time has gone on. And the links between population growth and climate change and other environmental degradation have become clearer. So, and I think these are incredibly important things, and I think we are increasingly within the foundation understanding the links and thinking that the provision of voluntary family planning, meeting a huge unmet demand, remains a critical strategy for us. The broader question of setting ambitious goals, I think, when I used in my example setting a target of only 80% of fifth graders reading at fifth grade level or doing math, that was realistic for this period. To set a target is not to deny having much more ambitious goals, but at any one time, you want to be able to actually accomplish something and then set higher goals.
Good. I'll do a last call if people want to send up question cards. We have about 10 minutes. We're running a little late because we started a little late. But I also want to ask a broader question. We've been speaking in kind of general terms about philanthropy and social innovation, but given where we are today, most of the people in this room, it's safe to say, have many fewer assets to devote to philanthropy than they had a year ago. What specific advice would you give, based on your own experience, as to what they should keep doing the same and what they should do differently? And I really hope we can come up with very actionable and concrete advice. So, Sandy, you're actually the only one here who, apart from Paul, who's at a foundation. What are you guys doing the same? What are you doing differently? What would you advise people?
I would start by saying it's all about leverage right now, and not the financial kind. That there's an opportunity, and I look at the Skoll Foundation particularly this way, that over our short life, we have developed what we look at as some pretty significant assets through our investments to date. And that would be the portfolio of Skoll Award recipients that we now have that represent the potential of this kind of big transformative change. We have an online community that has traction and attracts a big audience. We have a portfolio of film and broadcast content and distribution partners and relationships. And so doing more of the same for us doesn't necessarily have nearly the kind of impact that taking stock of what we've built and the ways that it can be integrated and the ways that we can leverage across different media relationships or across different platforms or look at what is going to provide the most value to the Skoll Award recipients at this point in time because they're going through their own adjustments because of the economy, and saying, what's the most strategic and highest leverage way that we can make incremental investments that will make the most of these assets that we've developed, rather than thinking of what we've done so far as sort of expenditures that have happened, grants that have gone out the door and they're gone. They're not. They've formed these assets. And I suspect at some level that's true for many of the people in this room. And so to do a stock taking of those assets and what opportunities are available and what kind of impact can be had with perhaps less dollars than before, because you're looking at specifically what you've learned and what you've got in your portfolio and working off of that.
So I agree with that, and I want to provide a not at all contradictory perspective, but a different answer to your question, Mark, which is I think that for foundations that have well thought through strategies and clear goals, this is the time to basically stick with those goals and not to abandon strategies, thinking that you can bob and foundations don't move very quickly, and I think to try to chase the crisis on the whole is not successful, and that leads. And again, I'll talk about the Hewlett Foundation because it's the foundation. It's the only foundation I really know very well. It's leading us to think in long term. Think about after we're out of this crisis, 3, 4, 5 years, I hope, what institutions and organizations do we need to have standing in the fields that we work that are going to be key to pursuing our goals and achieving our goals, whether they're in Africa or the US or elsewhere, and support those institutions. They're not going to be in limbo for the next 5 years, but support them in being active so that they are strong when we come out of the recession. But also, there are short-term opportunities. I mean, I think this administration has created short-term opportunities or immediate opportunities for us. The world of population, the working population has changed radically. Many of our organizations that we support are going from being oppositional to finding that they have allies both domestically and internationally. I think that's true of environment and climate change. And in education, the stimulus package is offering tremendous opportunities. So keep your eye on the long-term goals, but when there are real opportunities, seize them.
Terrific.
Sounds like a fortune cookie, I realize.
Akwasi?
Yeah, I think, I mean, generally speaking, my sense is that foundations are not terribly good at articulating their theory of change. I mean, theory of change is a buzzword, but when you really look, often foundations want to do so many things, and the theory of change isn't very clear. And this may be an opportunity to just step back instead of just cutting left, right, and center to say, well, what really what's going to, I think Paul's point is spot on. The second point I'll make is that, I mean, leveraging obviously is something, it's not even a choice. It's what we've got to do. And increasingly the question, of course, is how do you leverage? How do you go about it in a way that is a win-win for everyone? Because, everyone wants to leverage, and sometimes nobody wants to be leveraged. I think it's going to be in Africa, it's going to be very important for foundations that work in a continent with diminished or reduced resources to figure out some really smart ways of going about their work. I mean, you don't have to open offices or, have huge operational costs. I mean, there are African foundations you can work with, you can do re-granting, have all kinds of partnership arrangements. And then the final point I'll make, which is a very broad point, is that we all need to figure out a way to really punch above our weight. I mean, the less money you have shouldn't mean that you can't have even bigger dreams and bigger impact. And so the question is, how do you how do you punch above your weight? In Africa, it's possible. Leveraging is one, collaboration, partnerships. Re-granting is something I really think in the African context, given the new foundations, intermediary type foundations that exist today, will really, provide good dividends for any investment in that direction.
Good.
Yeah. And I should say institution, the point Paul made, which I started off, I think that's critical. Because ultimately, your footprints are going to be whether you have institutions and organizations and systems, mechanisms that remain after you're gone, as you would do someday.
Good. Sonal?
Well, we're spending money. No, I really think it's an opportunity more than it is a problem, because I think this is the time when we're looking at what's effective, what's working, how do we grow that, how do we make that happen, and who can we partner with that are willing to work with us in trying to prove that innovations are continuing. Despite the crisis, there's a lot of innovative ideas and interesting things happening. People in communities coming up with solutions, even with a little bit of money. Foundations working in innovative ways and trying to solve problems. Companies that are working with less but trying to do more. So I think there's a huge opportunity in this space to think about how do we find those solutions, how do we find those ideas, how do we give them a chance to grow, and how do we let the bottom-up innovations work in an effective manner, and how do we create the environment from our perspective, the policy environment, to allow that to happen.
And I'll just add, I think that the point that Sandy made about leverage, there really is tremendous growing interest in mission-related investing, impact investing, social investing, whatever you may call it, but using investment assets to promote businesses, for-profit enterprises, that actually are delivering social benefit. And interestingly, even in this economic downturn, the interest in those alternative kinds of investments, which have actually often outperformed the real investments, has not diminished. And that seems like a tremendous opportunity for leverage. I also think about the social entrepreneurs that we fund and that we honor. And I think in many ways, those social entrepreneurs didn't start out with any money behind them. And yet they developed a model, they created impact, they were able to raise money, but at the outset, they did it on a shoestring. And I think we as funders need to begin to think of ourselves not just as funding social entrepreneurs, but as social entrepreneurs ourselves, with the leadership and the drive and the energy to make change happen, not just to fund others to do it. And maybe this unfortunate crisis that we're living through helps us begin to think in terms of directly achieving impact ourselves and not merely delegating the responsibility to solve social problems to our grantees. So with that, I want to thank the panel. And thank all of you, and unless there are any announcements or Jane or someone jumps up, I think that's it for the evening. Thank you very much.